Number 15. The Kickstarter. Before the magic easy button appeared on your handlebars, starting a motorcycle was a physical workout. It was a test of manhood, patience, and ankle durability. The concept was simple enough. You had a lever connected to a ratchet gear, which spun the clutch basket, which spun the crankshaft, which hopefully fired the piston. On small displacement bikes it was fine, you could kickstart a Honda Cub with your hand, but on big singles or high-compression Harleys, it was a wrestling match. There was a genuine art form to this. You couldn't just stomp on it, you had to slowly push the lever down to find top dead center, the point of maximum compression. Then you had to pull a decompression lever if you were lucky enough to have one. And finally, you had to kick with the fury of 1,000 suns. If you got the sequence wrong, or if the ignition timing was slightly off, the engine would kick back. This was when the compression forced the lever back up against your foot with violent force.
Number 14. Drum brakes. Instead of a hydraulic caliper squeezing a disc, drum brakes worked by using a cam to expand two shoes inside a metal drum to create friction. In theory, and at low speeds, it worked fine. In the 1950s and 60s, some racing drum brakes were works of art, massive, finned magnesium hubs that looked incredible. But in reality, they were terrifying. Drum brakes had a fatal flaw called brake fade. As you use them, the heat would cause the metal drum to physically expand. As the drum got bigger, the shoes inside couldn't reach the walls anymore. So the harder you braked, the less braking power you actually had. You would squeeze the lever and it would just come back to the handlebar while you sailed past your turn. Even worse, they were not sealed perfectly. If you rode through a deep puddle, water would get inside the drum.
Number 13. The suicide shifter. We call it the suicide shifter for a reason. Back in the early days, basically anything pre-1950s American iron motorcycles did not have the standard left foot shift, right-hand brake layout we use today. It was the Wild West of ergonomics. Many American bikes, particularly Harley-Davidsons and Indians, used a foot clutch, just like a car, and a hand shifter mounted to the side of the fuel tank. Think about the logistics of this for a second. To stop at a red light, you had to disengage the clutch with your left foot. Then you had to keep your right foot on the brake pedal to stop from rolling. And finally, you had to take your left hand off the handlebars to find neutral with the shift lever. This meant you were balancing a 600-pound machine at a standstill with 0 feet on the ground. If you lost your balance, you fell over. Number 12. Two-stroke street bikes. From the 1960s through the 1980s, the streets were ruled by two-strokes. Bikes like the Yamaha RD350, the Suzuki GT750 Water Buffalo, and the legendary Kawasaki H2 Mach 4. These bikes were light, cheap, and dangerously fast. A two-stroke engine fires every single time the piston goes up, whereas a four-stroke only fires every other time. This meant a two-stroke made almost double the power of a four-stroke engine of the same size. They were violent. They had power bands that hit like a light switch. 1 second you were doing 30 miles per hour, the next the engine screams, the front wheel lifts, and you were looking at the sky. They were exhilarating, but they were flawed. They required you to mix oil into the gas or rely on oil injection pumps that sometimes failed. They fouled spark plugs if you rode them too slow. Number 11. Springer front ends. Before modern hydraulic forks, those smooth, oil-filled tubes that soak up bumps, we had Springer forks. If you look at an old pre-war bike, the front suspension looks like a medieval torture device made of exposed chrome springs and linkages. The concept was simple. Hit a bump and the springs compress. It worked, technically. The springs would bounce the wheel up and down, but there was almost no damping. Damping is the hydraulic resistance that stops the bouncing. Without it, you hit a pothole and the front end just keeps bouncing like a pogo stick for the next mile. Cornering on a Springer front end was absolutely terrifying. Because of the linkage design, the geometry of the bike would change as the suspension compressed. It made the bike feel like it had a hinge in the middle. Number 10. 6-volt electrical systems. If you ride a vintage bike at night, you know true fear. That is because old bikes used 6-volt electrical systems. Today, every vehicle on the road uses a 12-volt standard. But back in the day, 6 volts was all you got. The problem was that 6-volt systems were incredibly weak. The headlight was roughly as bright as a dying candle. You couldn't see the road, you were just hoping the road saw you. Even worse, the system didn't have enough power to run everything at once. If you were sitting in a traffic light and holding the brake lever, the brake light would draw so much power that the headlight would dim to almost nothing. If you tried to honk the horn while the turn signal was on, the engine might stall because the ignition lost spark. It was a constant balancing act of trying to keep the electrons flowing.
Number 9. Friction steering dampers. This one is wild to think about today. If you look at the top of the steering stem on many old British and Japanese bikes, you will see a giant plastic or metal knob. That is a friction steering damper. Steering dampers today are high-tech hydraulic pistons that stop the handlebars from shaking violently, known as a tank slapper. Back then, it was literally a giant screw that squashed 2 pieces of metal or cork together to make the steering stiff. Here was the procedure. If you were riding slowly in town, you had to unscrew the knob so you could turn the handlebars easily. But if you were about to merge onto the highway, you had to take your hand off the handlebars while riding and crank that knob tight. Number 8. Center stands as standard. Look at any bike from the 70s or 80s, even the sporty ones. They all had a center stand. This was an extra set of legs that lifted the rear wheel completely off the ground. It was brilliant. With a center stand, you could lube your chain anywhere. You could fix a flat tire on the side of the road because the wheel could spin freely. You could park on soft grass or hot asphalt without the bike falling over. It was the ultimate convenience feature. So where did they go? They got sacrificed to the gods of weight and style. Sport bikes wanted to be lighter, and a heavy steel stand added 10 pounds. Cruisers wanted to be lower, and the stand dragged in corners. Exhaust systems got bigger due to catalytic converters and took up the space under the engine where the stand used to live. Number 7. The choke lever. Young riders today will never know the struggle of the choke. Before fuel injection became the norm, bikes had carburetors, and carburetors are stupid. They don't know when it's cold outside. On a cold morning, fuel doesn't vaporize well. To start the bike, you had to pull a choke lever, usually located on the handlebar or down by the engine. This physically closed a flap in the carburetor to choke the air supply, creating a vacuum that sucked extra fuel into the engine. It was a delicate ritual. You had to pull the choke, start the bike, and listen to the engine rev high. Then, as the engine warmed up, you had to slowly, very slowly push the choke back in. If you pushed it in too fast, the bike would die. If you left it out too long, you would flood the engine and foul the spark plugs. Number 6. Tire tubes on street bikes. For a century, motorcycle tires were just like bicycle tires. They had a rubber inner tube inside to hold the air. This was necessary because old spoked wheels weren't airtight. The air would just leak out of the holes where the spokes connected to the rim. The problem with tubes is catastrophic failure. If you run over a nail on a modern tubeless tire, the rubber seals around the nail and the tire usually deflates slowly. You have time to pull over. If you puncture a tube at 70 miles per hour, it pops like a balloon. The tire goes flat instantly, the sidewall collapses, and you often lose control of the motorcycle. Plus, fixing a flat was a nightmare. You couldn't just plug it. You had to take the wheel off, pry the tire off the rim, pull the tube out, patch it, and put it all back together. Number 5. Mechanical anti-dive systems. The 1980s were a weird time for motorcycle technology. Manufacturers were trying everything to make bikes handle better. One big problem was brake dive. When you grabbed the front brake hard, the soft front suspension would collapse and the nose of the bike would dive toward the ground. The solution? Mechanical anti-dive. Suzuki called it ANDF, anti-nose dive forks. Honda had track. Basically, it was a complex system of plumbing connected to the brake caliper. When you squeezed the brake lever, the hydraulic pressure would close a valve inside the fork leg.
This restricted the oil flow and made the suspension instantly stiff to stop it from diving. Why did it fade? Because it felt terrible. When you're braking hard for a corner, you're often riding over braking bumps. If your suspension locks up and becomes solid rock right when you needed to absorb bumps, the front tire loses traction. Number 4. The Reserve Petcock. Before we had digital fuel gauges and miles-to-empty displays, we had the Petcock. This was a manual valve located under the fuel tank, usually on the left side. It had 3 positions: on, off, and reserve. Here is how you managed your fuel consumption back then. You rode the bike until the engine started sputtering and dying at 70 miles per hour on the highway. That was your low fuel warning. Then, while panicking and losing speed, you had to reach down between your legs, find the valve by feel, and twist it to the reserve position. This valve mechanically opened a lower intake straw inside the tank, giving you access to the last half-gallon of gas, just enough to find a station. It was a terrifying system. Number 3. Cassette players and CB radios. In the 1980s and 90s, the ultimate flex on a touring bike wasn't horsepower or cornering speed, it was audio. The Honda Goldwing and Harley-Davidson Electric Glide came from the factory with full-blown cassette decks built into the fairing. Imagine the luxury of riding down Route 66, wearing bulky gloves, trying to flip your mixtape of Born to Be Wild from side A to side B without crashing. It was the peak of high-tech touring. And let's not forget the CB radio. Before Bluetooth headsets and Cardo pack talks, riders communicated using citizen band radios. Touring bikes had massive whip antennas on the back, making them look like RC cars.
Number 2. The helmet lock. This one hasn't disappeared completely, but it has definitely faded from usefulness. The helmet lock. On older bikes from the 70s through the 90s, there was a dedicated key slot welded to the side of the frame. You unlocked a little heavy-duty hook, slid your helmet's D-ring onto it, and locked it. Your helmet was secure, hanging off the side of the bike. Why did it fade? Designers got lazy and cheap. On modern sport bikes, the helmet lock is often just a silly wire loop hidden under the passenger seat. To use it, you have to unlock the seat, remove the seat, hook the helmet, and lock the seat back on. It is a massive hassle.
Number 1. Factory turbo bikes. And finally, the coolest, most exciting, and most spectacular failure in motorcycle history, the factory turbo wars. For a brief shining moment, roughly 1982 to 1984, all 4 Japanese manufacturers decided that turbos were the future. They believed that instead of building bigger engines, they could take medium-sized engines, 500cc to 750cc, and strap turbochargers to them to make leader bike power. The Honda CX500 Turbo looked like a spaceship. The Yamaha Sika Turbo was futuristic. The Kawasaki GPZ 750 Turbo was actually legitimately fast. It was an arms race of forced induction. So why did they vanish? One major reason: turbo lag. On a motorcycle, you need precise throttle control, especially in a corner. With these early 80s turbos, you would open the throttle, wait 2 seconds, and then wham, the boost would hit all at once. If that happened while you were leaning over in a curve, you crashed. It was terrifying and unpredictable. Plus, the bikes were heavy, hot, complex, and expensive to insure. It turned out that just building a bigger engine, like the Suzuki GSX-R 750, was lighter, cheaper, and faster. The factory turbo bike died in 1985. Kawasaki recently brought the concept back with the supercharged H2, but for 30 years, forced induction was a ghost in the motorcycle world. So there you have it. Suicide shifters, Kickstarters, tape decks, and turbo lag. We hope you enjoyed this video. Here's another one you'll love. As always, thanks for watching.